And if you're just joining us, you have missed a lot, but don't worry, we'll catch you up because we are going to share videos, slides, our live transcription, the chat, and our live note-taking document with everybody afterward, as well as some fantastic illustrations that Derek Dent has done of every session at our summit. They're looking fantastic. So before we get started back up on our discussion about climate and collaboration, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. Questions for the panelists go in the Q&A box to talk amongst us. Use the chat function for that. And staff from the center, Denise and Ned primarily, will be dropping links into the chat to help keep us going. And if you have anything that you want to share, ask, offer, don't forget the Padlet is open for you. We've been dropping that link in there along with the password. So I think that's it. Let's get going. We've got all of our panelists here. So as I said, this next conversation is focusing on how journalists around the world are partnering together to cover it was the biggest crisis in our lifetime until recently, climate change. And as the climate crisis worsens around the globe, it has seemed that the number of journalism collaborations related to the environment have been increasing. And so to examine this, we hired Carrie Porter earlier this year to look at that. And she's going to talk a little bit about her research as part of this panel, and we're going to release that white paper later this year. So I just wanted to plug that early because I'm really excited about it. And I'm also very excited to introduce our host today, Lyndsey Gilpin of Southerly. She will be hosting the conversation and moderating the panel. So Lyndsey, I see you there. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Stefanie. I'm super excited for this panel. I've been waiting, it feels like forever for it, and I'm really excited to learn from the folks here that we have. I'll just do a quick intro, then they'll do their presentations, and then I'll ask a couple questions, and as you said, put stuff in the Q&A, and I can kind of gather your questions and throw them at everybody as we move through the session. So we have Allison Kopicki, who's a writer and researcher for Climate Central. We have Vernon Loeb, who is the executive editor of Inside Climate News. Mark Hertsgaard, who is executive editor of Covering Climate Now, and also environmental correspondent for The Nation. And we have Carrie Porter, as Stefanie mentioned, a journalist and media consultant. So I will throw it over to Carrie so she can start her presentation on her findings from her research.
Thanks so much, Lyndsey. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Well, I am so excited to be here. And like Lyndsey said, my name is Carrie Porter, and I am just going to share my screen. So we should be all set here. I am, like I said, so excited to be here. And also, I want to say thank you to you all for being here. And also thank you to the center for having me. I'm really excited to be learning from you all. And I'm sure I'm echoing many by saying that it's really inspiring to be part of this summit and to be learning from all of you. So I have been looking at climate collaborations. And there have been 3 guiding questions for the scope of my work. The first question is, what trends are we seeing in the types and timings of climate collaborations? So what that has actually looked like in practicality is a beautiful tracker with lots of colors. And this has been fun. So far, I've been able to gather more than 40 different climate-specific collaborations within the past decade. And of course, this is growing, and it's not, I'm not going to pretend like I have all of them, but it is useful in giving us a sense of the landscape for how climate collaborations have functioned over the past decade. And there's 2 main findings that have come from this tracker. The first one, and also through interviews, I should say, doing a lot of interviews with practitioners in the field. The first one is we have this kind of wave, this 2-point wave with climate collaborations, where we saw a peak in 2010, and then we saw it kind of leveled down for a little and then went up in the past couple of years. And then with this past year, we had a big spike in the number of climate collaborations, which makes sense if you think about how climate is becoming an increasingly, it's always been important, but it's inevitable. Like, you can't miss the weather news that we're seeing. So this is one thing. The second thing is, as we've been looking at these climate collaborations, we've been thinking about their structure. So how do we kind of classify them, or what's the typology? And for that, it seems as though there's 5 different categories that we can loosely group these into. And so I'm going to briefly run through these. The first one is the connector. And I'm sure Allison can talk about some of her work, but this is essentially when you have a middle person who's able to bring together the scientists and the journalists and build pathways and efficiencies that haven't existed before. The second, resource sharing, is something that we heard a lot about earlier when we were talking about especially the Center for Public Broadcasting and the local centers for journalism that they produced, where you have one reporter shared among newsrooms. The third is syndication. So we see this, this often can crop up around like big events, like when the UN has a summit on climate, or that's an opportunity for syndication. I'm sure that's something that Mark can also speak to in a minute. Fourth, feature partnerships. So this is something we're seeing a lot more of, which is neat. Essentially, if you have one news organization that has excellent chops in data, and another news organization that has excellent chops in local sourcing, and you bring those two together to focus on a specific feature story. The fifth is around product creation. And to be clear, I've only actually found one of these. I'm sure there's more, and you can tell me what those are. But essentially, when we build out products that enhance that news reporting and dissemination. So in terms of the numbers that we're seeing, it's pretty clear that syndication, resource sharing, and feature partnership, which is a lot of the reporting on the ground, if you will, like those are the types of climate collaborations that we're seeing the most of. And when you bring these two together, you have a chart, a pretty chart that shows you essentially those 2 peaks that I mentioned. And then you can also see what I want to draw your attention to here is, I think that the feature partnerships, the green, is what has really increased over the past couple of years, which I believe also is an indication of how, as collaboration is becoming more commonplace, it's also becoming more common that we see this in climate, which is really neat to see. So the second kind of guiding question has been, why does collaboration uniquely address the complexities of climate journalism? You know, why specifically would we use collaboration to cover climate? And for this, I've found, and a lot of this is coming through interviews, 5 different findings. The first one is, with climate, there is a history around denial and confusion, mistrust. And so when we work together, we reduce that noise around issues of bias and mistrust. So if a news organization happens to have the respect of a particular reader and you partner with that news organization, you get to leverage and buy into that trust. And so, in the aggregate, that's really meaningful and powerful. The second finding is, we know climate is something that requires a lot of depth and knowledge. And as the industry has struggled to support funding beat journalists and science reporters, by being able to collaborate, we can improve the expertise for covering these subjects. The third finding is that by working together, inevitably, it moves up the issue on the agenda. Something that I was interested to learn is how often reporters had to persuade their editors to cover climate stories. And so collaborations have been meaningful ways for receiving buy-in in newsrooms. And I also think from audiences, and one of the neat things about this is, as it grows in importance on the news agenda, it also makes way for being able to really get your sources on the horn. I think that's still a phrase, on the phone, I mean. And fourth finding is that the thing about collaborations is that they also mimic climate, which is that, it doesn't follow along neat and tidy territory lines. And so when you can collaborate on covering a resource, that means you can expand and more comprehensively cover the subject. And finally, it creates a healthy checks and balances, which I think makes sense. So now moving on to our third question, which is inevitably impact. And I was really excited in the previous session to learn about the ways that impact is being thought through. And I'm like really excited to dig into that more. But so far, we know that the number of climate stories is increasing. So this graph shows you how you can see that spike in around 2010 again. And then also, I think, it's worth noting the 2010 downturn in climate news. The director of the ice caps, which puts together this work, Max explained to me that he believes that's directly proportional to COVID, which is interesting. And the second measurement of impact is perception and importance. And this is a report that came out of Pew earlier this year showing that the number of Americans who believe climate change is a priority has gone up dramatically, which is good to note. So that is a brief summary of where we are in preliminary research. And as Stefanie said, we'll be putting this out in early summer. So please keep an eye out. And if you have feedback, let me know. I'm eager to talk.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. That was fascinating. I have many questions myself, but we're going to throw it over to Mark, who will present his work. I think you're muted, Mark.
Oh,
there you go. Yeah.
I was unmuted by the host, however. Hey, everybody. I hope you can hear and see me. If not, give a shout or give a wave or something like that. I'm Mark Hertsgaard. I'm the Executive Director of Covering Climate Now. We are a collaboration of news outlets from across the United States and around the world, over 400 news outlets. Happy to say that one of them is coming up shortly behind me here, Vernon Loeb at Inside Climate News, the Pulitzer Prize winning digital site that broke the story some years ago about how the big oil companies have been lying about climate change for decades now. And just a quick history of us, we started about a year ago in response to the United Nations IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, landmark October 2018 scientific report, the 1.5 degrees report, in which they said essentially that the old benchmark of trying to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees C was maybe not such a good idea after all. And we had to instead be aiming for 1.5 degrees, and that in turn will require us to basically cut emissions in half by 2030. You'll remember some of the headlines at that point, that 12 years to cut emissions in half. The scientists said at that time, and this is what gets to collaboration among journalists, I think, they said that in order to have this kind of transformation of cutting emissions in half, we needed to see transformational change in the energy sector, in the financial sector, the construction sector, the agriculture sector, et cetera, et cetera. And they left out, I think, perhaps the most important sector, which is the media sector. Because unless there was transformation of the media sector, there would never be the other transformations in those other sectors, because there simply would not be the public awareness and therefore the political pressure on governments and corporations to change fast enough. So that was the genesis of Covering Climate Now, was the idea that, okay, let's try and transform the media sector. And we were focused initially mainly on the United States for the simple reason that the United States media has long been at least 10 years behind the overseas media, especially in Europe, in covering the climate issue. And we thought that that needed to change. And we also thought, and this was sort of our theory of change at the time, that my own knowledge of other reporters, I knew that there were a lot of journalists who knew darn well that we were not doing justice to the climate story and that we had to do better. And so we thought, the co-founders were myself at The Nation magazine and Kyle Pope at the Columbia Journalism Review. We thought that there actually is a critical mass of journalists out there who knew that we needed to do better on the climate story. And then if we could somehow highlight that critical mass, we could grow that critical mass. And this gets to a point that Kerry just made, that when journalists, and especially when the editors and the producers who run newsrooms, when they see that other news organizations are doing something, that then gives them, call it what you will, either the incentive or the political cover to do it themselves. Because as we all know, the one thing that no journalist ever wants to be is behind the curve. So we decided to start covering climate now on that basis. We had a conference at the Columbia Journalism School. It was oversubscribed. There was enormous interest. And then we said, well, let's try and get everybody together to do a week of coverage around climate stories. And to our, we thought we'd have a couple dozen news outlets who would join together on this, and some of the models that Kerry mentioned. To our astonishment, within a week, we had 60 organizations, including big shots like CBS News and Bloomberg. And that, again, really helped then further draw in people. It was, again, this theory of if you highlight the critical mass will grow. And by the time we did our week of coverage in the September of 2019 around the UN Climate Action Summit, we had 323 different news outlets across the US and around the world who were collaborating together. The idea was that we would share content. Nobody was obliged to share their content, nor were they obliged to run content that came from others. It was optional. And and this is, again, I think something about collaboration, at least the model that we chose, and it's worked quite well. We made a very, very low bar for entry. You were not required to pay any money. We had funding from, God bless them, the Schumann Media Center to run the organization. So when we went to somebody like, say, CBS or Bloomberg, we could say, look, it's not going to cost you a penny to join this. And second, there is no editorial line. You're not required to run a certain number of stories. You're not required to do anything, with one exception: you must respect climate science. We have a zero tolerance policy towards climate denial. But beyond that, how you decide to tell the story is up to you. You know your newsroom and your audience better than we can ever do it. What we're here to do is to spur you on, to give you background information, training sessions, etc., for how to cover this story. Because lots of newsrooms, especially again in the United States, they were beginning to realize that the climate story was huge. It is the biggest crisis of our time, with all due respect and sympathy for COVID-19 victims. COVID-19 is just a dress rehearsal for a far bigger crisis. If we don't get climate change under control, the whole planet's going to be uninhabitable for all of us, not just those of us who are suffering from COVID-19 now. And so newsrooms were beginning to understand that, but a lot of them, a surprising number of them, did not know what to do. I'm not going to name the name, but one of the very biggest news organizations in the world, a name you would all recognize, said in the very first meeting, we know we have to do this. How do we do it? Can you give us some story ideas? So we provide that. And one of the things that we do, and Vernon can maybe speak to this later, is just to connect outfits that are big, like Reuters is part of our outfit, and Bloomberg, I mentioned, Agence France Presse. Those are 3 of the 4 biggest news agencies in the world. Each of them in turn service thousands of newsrooms themselves. We point out to them, hey, there's a lot of expertise out there already with outfits like Inside Climate News. Start reading their stuff, and you're going to report the story differently, but that's your kind of way in. And this worked really, really well. And one of the other reasons that it worked well, I think, well, let me just give a quick data point there. In that week in September of 2019, our collaborators, the 323 news outlets, did at least 3,640 news stories about climate change in that 1 week, 7 days. So talking about 500 stories plus a day. And in so doing, we also noticed, and this is not something you can empirically prove, we noticed that other big news organizations that were not part of Covering Climate Now, nevertheless, up their own climate coverage. Because again, as I said earlier, no newsroom wants to look like they're behind the curve. And so Time Magazine, which frankly declined our offer to join the collaboration, nevertheless, that week they had a cover story on climate change. USA Today, same thing. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they all declined to join the collaboration, but they all boosted their coverage that week, partly because they knew their peers and competitors were doing it as well. So that's a very valuable thing, and Kerry mentioned it too, that collaborations can do. It can make it something that the rest of our colleagues in the media feel like they've got to pay attention to. And finally, and I'll end on this, the other reason I think that this has been so successful and so attractive to newsrooms is that increasingly there's the recognition, especially at mainstream outlets, that climate change is a story the audience wants to hear. That was never the case. I've been covering climate change for 30 years now, from all around the world and much of the US. It was always a struggle to get editors and producers to do this story because they believed that it was an audience turnoff. The polling data on that has reversed dramatically in the last 18 months. And now, and I'm going to mainly talk about the United States here, if you're under the age of 40, it almost doesn't matter what your political ideology is. Independents, Republicans, Democrats, all of them want to know about climate change because, as was mentioned, you can't deny it any longer. You can see what's happening in the weather. And so as a result of that, a lot of our partners are now saying that their climate coverage, not only is it actually drawing audiences and therefore revenue, but also during the COVID-19 crisis, the one story that newsrooms have found has been breaking through to audiences and still getting traction and traffic has been climate. So I think that's something that again shows the value of these kinds of collaborations. The Covering Climate Now collaboration now has over 400 news outlets. Our combined audience is approaching, if not beyond, 2 billion people. And of course, we invite anyone who is out there, all bona fide news outlets are invited to join us. Just send us an email at editors@coveringclimatenow.org. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark. That's a nice bright spot, I think, in all the COVID coverage is knowing that the climate change stuff is breaking through. I think about that a lot too lately, about how this is sort of a practice run. So it's pretty scary. But just a quick reminder that if you all have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I think Ned just made a thing in the chat about this, but throw them in there and I will kind of sort through them and either answer them or keep them for later on when we open it up to Q&A. So feel free to do it as you think of things. So now we're going to move on to Vernon from Inside Climate News. And Vernon, I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks, Lyndsey. And it's great to hear Mark talk. Let me just, before I start, give you a little example of how collaboration works. So Mark's editors from Covering Climate Now will call me, regularly and ask about a piece that we'd published. Can they take it and can they offer it to their partners? And we always say, yes, we'd love you to do that. Last couple of days ago, he asked me about a piece we had written about young climate conscious Republicans who had sort of started a movement within the Republican Party and have come out with their own answer to the Green New Deal. Mark's folks were interested in the piece. We said, take it. And today, I think it was in the Desmog blog, a terrific blog, by the way. And it was just a great example of how collaborating, we amplify the impact of all of our journalism. And Mark's group is just fabulous. They put out a great weekly newsletter, and it's just a great repository of stories for all of us to tap into and contribute to and use. I spent my whole career in newspapers. I've been at Inside Climate News for a year. And one of my favorite things about the nonprofit sector is just how collaborative it is and how, nonprofits, for the most part, don't really compete with each other. They collaborate with each other. We have a mantra at Inside Climate News. We don't have competitors. We only have partners. And when you start to look at the world that way, opportunity just expands all over the place. So instead of trying to wall off what you're doing and hide what you're doing until you're ready to publish it, you tell your potential partners about what you're doing and get them to help you or offer to help them. So it's a really great space, I think, for that reason. Before I describe our partnerships, let me just tell you a little bit about Inside Climate News. So we're about 12 years old. We started out off as basically a blog, and we have now grown to about 20 journalists. We're a small news organization, but we're a big climate desk. And we have a lot of firepower to bring to the story. We're known for our kind of long form enterprise and our investigations. We won the Pulitzer back in 2013 for stories about what we like to call the biggest oil spill you've never heard of. It was an oil spill in Kalamazoo, the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. And it happened to happen right when that big gushing oil geyser in the Gulf of Mexico was happening. And nobody, hardly except us, covered this oil spill in Michigan. It was this really viscous tar sands oil from Canada, and it was just made for a really great investigation. And then we were Pulitzer finalists 3 years later for public service for the story that Mark mentioned, a series of stories we wrote about how Exxon had in the late 70s done their own research and determined that climate change essentially imperiled the planet. And they then went on to bury their own research and fund climate denial for the next couple of decades. And so that's probably the story we're best known for. And as I said, we're now a newsroom of about 20 journalists. We produce stories every day. We have beats. And our kind of latest thrust is we're creating regional environmental reporting networks around the country. We kind of, in addition to our long form journalism, we sort of see as paramount to our public service mission now, our role of sort of force multiplier for environment journalism. So we've started creating these networks. We have one in the Midwest and in the Southeast, two networks that are actually functioning. We've got a person ready to go in the Mountain West based in Salt Lake City, and we were supposed to have had our opening conference there, but for the pandemic, we would have had our third network going. And we have a fourth network on the drawing board. We've hired a correspondent in California who's going to create a California network. And because of our funder out there, that network is going to have kind of an agricultural slant to it because our funder is very, very interested in climate and agriculture in California. Each of our networks kind of takes on its own flavor based on the issues in the region and the kind of the skills of the individual skills of the people we've hired to run them. The networks basically consist of newspapers, public radio stations, smaller nonprofit, city magazines, and the like. And the way we've started them is we kind of put out a notice that we're forming this network and sort of invite interested newsrooms to participate. And we then, the response has been enormous. And then we'll pick, say, 10 or 15, it's usually around 15 participants. We pay their expenses. They come to a conference that lasts for a couple of days where we'll bring in climate scientists to talk about attribution science and things like that. And then we'll spend a couple of days brainstorming ideas. And then ultimately we all publish jointly on whatever the theme we've chosen was, sort of like Covering Climate Now did during Climate Week. And then after that, we sort of, it's sort of where we are now, sort of partnerships 2.0. Where do we go from there? We're contemplating creating story banks, kind of modeled after the Florida newspaper cooperative, where everybody in the collaborative contributes links to their climate stories, and then everybody else in the collaborative can withdraw from the story bank. In the Southeast, the guy we have running the network is named Jim Bruggers, who's the old environment reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal. Given his background and his relationships, he's had great success producing stories for and with some of the Gannett papers in Kentucky and Tennessee. In the Mountain West, our reporter happens to be a public radio journalist, and she's already tapped into a public radio network out there. She writes well, and so she can write print, but she also loves to do public radio audio stories. So that's kind of the forming up to be the flavor in the West. As I said, the California partnership is going to be focused on agriculture, and in the Midwest, our correspondent is named Dan Garino, who was the environment reporter at the Columbus Dispatch. He has a real interest in renewable energy. So he produces a weekly newsletter in renewable energy, which we're now starting to market and kind of offer to newspapers in the region as something they might want to use either as an email newsletter or on their website. When I say market, we're offering it for a great price, free. All of our content is free. We give it to our partners, again, as part of our sort of force multiplier mission. And Mark was saying, I'm always amazed at how much interest there is in partnerships these days, and they're very meaningful. We'll go to a paper and offer an idea, and they'll contribute a reporter or a photographer, and we'll contribute, bring some expertise to bear, and the result is always really terrific. I feel like we're barely scratching the surface in terms of the way we can partner with people. The five forms of partnership that were discussed earlier, we do all of those. And as I say, there's probably a lot more out there. So again, if you're listening and you wanna, you're interested in climate journalism and you're interested in our content, or you're interested in working with us, call me, email me, and I'll get back to you. I've already, for example, talked to Lyndsey about doing just this with her great magazine called Southerly, just in talking to her last week for about 20 minutes, it was clear to me that we had so many like zones of commonality. I had absolutely no doubt that soon we'll be partnering on some really good stories. So anyway, I'll stop there, and really great to be here.
Thanks, Vernon. Yeah, it's great to just even start these conversations, like no agenda. I've heard this a lot during this conference, is just start talking about it, and something will come up eventually, or you'll be in the back of somebody's head when they're thinking of a collaboration. So I think that's really important, even though you may not have a specific project in mind. So for sure, I really like that. All right, so finally, we're gonna give the floor over to Allison from Climate Central. I'm excited to hear what she has to say.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. It's a little low, but we can hear you.
Okay. I'll try and turn it up a little bit. Speak closer to my mic. Okay, and I'm going to share my screen. This one. All right. Okay, so can you guys all see that about climate?
Good to go. Yep.
Great. So we're a little bit of a motley group of climate and data scientists, meteorologists, journalists, former journalists, digital communications experts, and graphic artists. We have three main programs: Climate Matters, Partnerships Journalism Program, and we have a Sea Level Rise team. We are nonprofit, nonpartisan, and we do not do advocacy. Some of you may already subscribe to our, there we go. Some of you may already subscribe to our weekly Climate Matters program, which is a partnership with a whole host of organizations. And here's our collaboration. And besides other journalists, we also partner with NOAA, NASA, the American Meteorological Society, the Society of Environmental Journalists, and George Mason University's Center for Climate Change Communication, among many others. And it was the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. They did a poll and found out, and this is sort of where the Climate Matters program came from, that the Americans trusted their local weathercasters almost the most of anybody anybody in the media. So we started with one weathercaster in 2010, and since then we are now, I think as of last week, at over 900 TV meteorologists and 615 journalists and reporters in newsrooms across the country. While we do work with national networks and newspapers, the program is really geared to support local newsrooms, whether it's television, digital, radio, or print. Okay. Our aim is to assist meteorologists and journalists in basically reporting on the climate impacts and solutions in ways that are local, immediate, and personal, and that they're grounded in the latest science. So all of our reporting tools, and you're starting to see a few of these here, are available free of charge to anyone interested in telling engaging local science-based stories about how global climate change is impacting their community, why it matters, and what can be done about it. On a weekly basis, our team creates a package that includes data analysis, graphics, narrative, and usually a mix of national and local. We provide some local story angles and links to local resources and links to national experts as well, who are vetted and ready to get interviewed by reporters across the country. So we provide the climate science, it's vetted by our experts in our team, and then we're asking reporters to do the local reporting, to be interviewing their local health experts or local doctors, their state climatologists, or their neighborhood residents who are experiencing these conditions, whether it's poor air quality or higher temperatures or allergy season increasing. And also we do a Spanish translation of all of this every week. And we try to do a mix of topics that aim to bring the global climate change issue, again, down to a local level, a more personal level. We all know that consumers of news respond to things that are personal. Money, financial, how money and finance affects them, stories about their own safety, their local economy, and their community. So we looked at, for this first one, this local and state property values in coastal flood zones that are going to be affected by sea level rise. So again, where it's going to hit many people who live along the coast and their communities in their home values and their insurance. For the Midwest, we looked at how farmers can be a part of a climate solution, sequestering carbon through sustainable farming practices. Again, that things in the Midwest and in farming and in rural, we were trying to bring climate change to and climate solutions to rural areas. We also, again, try to do some lighthearted ones. Climate change is obviously very serious, but to give materials to report on hobbies and sports and popular culture and just basically how our daily lives are going to get impacted. So for the start of football season, it's a very popular one. We look at all the NFL cities and how those cities the heat is increasing since 1970 and how those cities are warming. And of course, everybody likes beer. So unfortunately, climate change is really going to be impacting some of the major elements in beer and making it a lot more expensive for us to get those brews. What we've heard back from our reporters is that they like this mix. A lot of them are like the longer, and when they have the time to do the more in-depth pieces, sort of the coastal flood zone piece. But they also, as you all know, reporters and journalists and meteorologists are all needing to feed the beast, right? And they have to get out quick articles so their editors stop harassing them. This is a great way for them to get that out there. So if you're not already signed up, check out Climate Matters on our website. Please sign up. You can also go to newsroom@climatecentral.org. Let us know what you want to receive, if you want to receive our weekly releases. We have a media library. We do have a little bit of an ancient website. We are in the process of revamping it, but we have this great media library. So all of our stuff that we've been doing for years are there, and you can search by topic, heat, rain, snow, or by a solution like wind energy, or by a media market. And I wanted to know, we are entering summer, which is a time of extreme weather. We're facing hurricane season, extreme heat events. We've had tornadoes already, and there's wildfires already in Florida. So we do have a great place if there's extreme weather in your area of the country. These have kind of repackaged those resources so you can get to them immediately. So then there's our partnerships journalism program, and this is more directly, it's a small, John Upton leads it. And we partner directly with reporters and editors in local newsrooms. And I think this goes to one of the questions that came up. Local editors have traditionally felt kind of nervous about wading into climate coverage. Again, there's a lot of science behind this, and their newsrooms are all stretched thin. We do help local reporters with the science and the data reporting and the editing, and ensure that their climate coverage is scientifically bulletproof. So if we partner with you in this, we will vet all of the science and make sure whatever goes out there is accurate. We often hire a freelance science or data journalist to work with a local news outlet on specific projects. And we try and kind of provide a mentoring aspect. There's a lot of young environmental reporters who don't have anybody to help teach them within their own newsrooms, and so we're there for that. Local outlets, again, have told us that they're desperate to cover climate change, but they're all stretched thin. I mean, one of my partner reporters at NJ.com, he's worked with us on flooding and other climate articles, but I see his byline on New Jersey lottery winner stories too. So, what we're trying to say is we're steeped in the science. We have colleagues who know and live the science, and so we can support them. Some of these partnership journalism stories that we've worked with around the country include wildfires, poor air quality issues, risk and dangers of playing sports on extreme heat index days, and even the power of trees to combat flooding in Portland, Oregon. Just with COVID, just so you all know, we kind of took a bit of a pause at pitching our climate stories to local journalists, as we knew a lot of the local newsrooms were, in an all hands on deck mode, and maybe they didn't want to do a flooding story in the middle of COVID, but now they will be. So instead, John and I created a workshop series for meteorologists and reporters on tips and ways to cover these upcoming disasters during COVID, how to prepare for and evacuate from these incidents are going to be very different during COVID with social distancing. Our first briefing a couple of weeks ago was a general overview and all the disasters coming our way and how to stay safe. We partnered with the International Association of Emergency Managers. We had a great response, so we started to do more. We had one yesterday. I think we had over 200 people on it on how to cover wildfire season. Last week of May, we'll be covering hurricanes and coastal flooding and how to report on those events. And in June, extreme heat events. And so we bring together scientists, health experts, emergency management experts, and folks with experience in recovery after, because it's all going to look very different with COVID. We've also brought in reporters and meteorologists for peer-to-peer learning during those workshops. And it's all online. So our last set of tools that I wanted to point to is for journalists, comes from our Sea Level Rise program. For reporters near the coast, both in the United States and globally, these are absolutely invaluable tools to report on sea level rise and storm surge and how it will be affecting your local areas. This Risk Finder tool in the middle here, it allows you to look at any coastal location in the United States, set a water level, say for storm surge or sea level rise of 5 feet, and it will automate a fact sheet of what's at risk: schools, roads, brownfield sites, all kinds of really wonky, cool things that you could actually write a story about. The coastal risk tool, screening tool, is global. Okay, so this one allows you to look at any coastal location around the globe. You can use the slider on the left sidebar, and this one's automated. I hope everybody's seeing this. I did not do this, a colleague did. And you can see the progression of flood risk by decade until the end of the century, okay? And you can see what's gonna be the red areas, what's gonna be underwater. And like every month, they're updating these and adding new bells and whistles. So, keep coming back to our website. They're really incredible. And then finally, another tool that we have is something called the Portfolio Analysis Tool. And we've done some partnership journalism on this with groups. What this tool allows us is to be in a very specific place to calculate the risk of coastal flooding through the future. We looked at the space launch complexes of Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center, and you can see this. And we found that many of these complexes are already experiencing frequent flood risk. It's hard to say. And it's projected to become chronic in the next few decades. And it was a great partnership program. Florida Today worked with us on that. And we had our freelance journalist co-byline with that. And she checked all the She was helping with all the science behind that and with Bay News 9. So basically, please, we want to hear from you. You can write me directly. You can write John directly. Go to our website, sign up for all the free things, and I'll stop my share there. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. That was awesome. I really encourage everyone, if you haven't looked through all those tools, to play around with them. It's very, very helpful. And the series that Climate Central has been doing, I've found incredibly helpful as well, and organized really well. So I have a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So like I said, throw your questions in the Q&A, and I will sort of figure out how to ask them. So this is pretty much for everybody. I am curious to hear what the journalists think, and then also, Kerry, what you have found in your research or might be looking for in your research. One of the things that keeps me up at night is how we get information about climate change out to people who need access to it, who lack access to it, because they're in a news desert, or because their local news outlet just can't cover it, doesn't have the resources to cover it, or because they've been misinformed. And so I run a nonprofit digital magazine that covers climate issues, among other things, in the American South. And I do, address this by partnering with or syndicating stories with local news outlets. But, this is just such a big thing. Like, we can talk about climate as much as we want and share it with each other on Twitter, right? But what does that do? And so I'm curious to hear how you all address this in your collaborations and in thinking about what are the ways that we can actually make this information useful and start to move the needle on people's kind of understanding of climate change and preparation for it, right? Or responses to it. So anyone can jump in, sorry.
I'll jump in quickly. One of the things that Covering Climate Now is doing in that regard is we are focusing on working with mainstream news organizations. I think, frankly, that the independent press and the progressive press in the United States has been covering the climate story pretty well for 10 years now. And it's the mainstream media that has been so far behind. And I'm talking about the big networks. I suspect that a lot of people on this call probably don't watch much network television news. So it's important to remember that those are still by far the biggest audiences in the country. When you're on the Today Show, which announced on Earth Day that they were joining Covering Climate Now at NBC News, that reaches 5 million people right there in that moment. The nightly news broadcasts of ABC, CBS, NBC, they reach roughly 30 million people a night. And then, of course, there's huge digital operations as well. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we're trying to do is to get mainstream news organizations to realize and incorporate, frankly, the work that Vernon and his colleagues are doing at Inside Climate News and other specialists are doing. And the second point here is to point out to news organizations who are not yet doing the climate story that this is actually a revenue source. It is not a revenue loss. That is outdated information that somehow covering climate change is an audience turnoff. That is simply no longer the case.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say that, yeah, we do more or less the same. We're trying to work with newspapers and NPR stations. Part of the reason we set up our networks where we did was the feeling that these were, if not news deserts, regions of the country that weren't all that well served, or weren't, totally getting up every morning and reading the New York Times or the Washington Post. And it's interesting, the Post just won a Pulitzer for explanatory journalism for just an absolutely dynamite climate series. And I think the LA Times was a Pulitzer finalist for a climate game they created. So I think those big wealthy national newspapers that aren't going out of business right now are covering climate like really well. It's the struggling chain newspapers that are owned by these chains that McClatchy is bankrupt, Gannett stock is below $1 or close to $1. People are being furloughed. It's newspapers that serve much of the country that we're trying to help with partnerships and content.
It's the same thing for us. We're trying to give away what we write for free, right? And all of our graphics for free. You know, one of the biggest hit stories was that carbon dioxide levels are increasing the toxicity of poison ivy. Do you know how many, like, that hit like gardeners and a lot of our older, readers and listeners across the country. And that's what we're just saying. We can do a really funky graphic. It's a quick hit. Gets in people's head, oh, that's happening and it's happening to me and that's why this is happening. And again, like I said, we know that these local newsrooms are completely stretched. So we can give you the science. If you have questions, we can vet it. We can hook you up with local resources or local experts. And I'll look for someone at local universities who can speak to reporters. We're there to do that legwork for people who don't have the time.
And if I could add, during your presentation, Allison, I signed up for Climate Matters. I of course know all about what you do and where you're coming from, but actually had never actually signed up personally. So now I have, and you're in Princeton, right?
They're based in Princeton. We're all spread out now.
Right.
We have about 30 people, and we have some people on the West Coast and scientists all over. I think the key thing is too, we put out about 4 or 5 reports a year, which we really hope that people will just take and use. And you don't need to say that we wrote it. I'll cut and paste. That is against most journalists' basic instinct. And I think that is something that we have to figure out how to say, we're okay. Some climate science has to be written in a certain way. I get into fights with my sea level rise scientists about how to, talk about risk in the future, because they want to be very cautious about how we talk about, risk of flooding. And we need to get it into language that most people won't glaze their eyes over. That's a tension that I'm happy to have. But that's what I mean. If people just want to take exactly how we've written a phrase sometimes, I think that's what we have to get a lot of journalists used to doing.
Yeah, thanks. It's sort of related that you had mentioned this, Allison, getting at what people really care about, their bank accounts and their families and their farms and these things. And Inside Climate News does this a lot as well, really showing how people are already being affected. And I often say, like, it doesn't really matter to me what they call it, as long as they're like talking about flooding and like what they're doing to adapt to it. I feel like that's it. Like, that's a climate story, right? And I think broadening, I don't know, I'm just kind of interested to hear how you all approach, like, in newsrooms, maybe it's not a climate reporter, right? Maybe it's a business reporter or an ag reporter that's covering climate change now. And I think that'll become more and more common as we move forward.
So we had a great report out last year on heat and sports. So, and that was one of the things, the Corey Stringer Institute, we worked with them. They're up at University of Connecticut. It was named for a football player, Minnesota Vikings, who collapsed from the heat and died. Because climate change, because we're seeing higher heat index days all across the country, we need to get that health impacts out. This is, how much of the country plays football. Was a way for us to get that story in there and to get doctors to start even understanding that they should be talking about climate change and the impact as well.
Thanks.
Interesting you say that. We did one last year on heat deaths in the military. And very much the same thing, right? They're not playing football, they're out drilling on these bases across the deep south where it's incredibly hot all summer. And, the casualties pile up.
Yeah, definitely. Mark, we had a question mostly for you, but others feel free to chime in. It was really about impact. You had talked about publishing, hundreds of stories, right, on climate change during this week. But do you track the impact with the audience on those stories? And also how are you thinking about, as we move ahead, like into as climate change gets more serious, how do we sort of measure how people are understanding it and reacting to it and sharing information? How are you all looking at that?
Thanks for that question. Let me preface it by saying one thing that's very general and not related to climate collaboration per se, but rather collaborative journalism. I'm so glad that more of us are doing collaboration now, because I've been in the business long enough. And I think the fact is that a lot of our previous antipathy to collaboration and preference from competitiveness was essentially about our own egos as journalists, as people, not about serving the public. And I think that one of the nice things about this moment is we are able now to remember that, yeah, we work for, we get paid by the publisher or the station manager, but we work for the public. And we work for the public better sometimes when we collaborate, rather than worrying about who had which story 5 minutes before somebody else. As for us, we do try to measure these things, and it was thousands of stories, not hundreds, thousands of stories that we ran in the September week, and we did another week of coverage around Earth Day this year, where it was closer to hundreds of stories in that case because of COVID-19. Some of our partners couldn't collaborate as much. And I think that, of course, we try to measure how much things get picked up, and you can follow the traffic and so forth. But I sense that perhaps the question is also getting at the much harder to resolve issue of, well, how do you know if you're having impact on people? And I think we can never, as journalists, quite know the answer to that. You don't know. It's very, very rare that a specific story actually leads to, oh, that mayor got recalled. That does happen, but it's relatively rare. I mean, again, look at what Inside Climate News did with its Exxon New revelations. That was incredible. That was by far the most important investigative story on the climate front ever in the United States. And yet, you can still have a president of the United States and one of the two major political parties who are denying science on climate change. So we have to, of course, we always want to be as relevant as we can to our audiences, but we can't get too caught up in saying, oh, well, did it lead to X outcome right away? Those things generally cannot be measured, and yet it is unquestionable that that happens. As I said earlier, the whole reason that we founded Covering Climate Now was because we believe that unless we transform the media sector and get real news out to more people about this crisis, that you'll never have the public awareness and the political pressure to force governments and corporations to act soon enough to avoid catastrophe.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any thoughts on impact or
just what, as a former pollster, recovering pollster, I have to, put a plug in for, George Mason is, follows and tracks behavior and thoughts about climate change. And they've done such a great job over the years. It's hard to say, as all of this journalism, creating that impact or people actually changing their behavior. People like to lie about their behavior in a poll or fib a little. How many days did you work out last week? Oh, all 6 of them. Did you, do recycling last week? That kind of thing. It's hard to measure that behavior, but you are seeing some signs of that, and that their website has a lot of really good polling data on that.
Thanks. Kerry, I have a question for you, actually. I am curious what has, just in your research, what has surprised you about what you're finding out about these collaborations, and sort of what you're excited to see in the future, sort of like as there's more stakeholders involved in these collaborations. We're talking about bigger issues, like not just strictly climate, right, science, it's like environmental justice and all of these other things that's affecting. And what are you kind of seeing and looking forward to seeing in more of your research?
Thank you. That's such a fun question. I had one conversation with an academic who he's actually behind the ice caps graph. You guys remember that one where they're tracking all the media stories. And something that we talked about was resilience. How do we build collaborations that are resilient? And I think this tethers to some of the other themes that have come up in the conference so far around business models and how do we pay for this? Like, how do we move beyond a reliance that's foundation or philanthropic? pretty much entirely. So I think that to me is an opportunity to pivot in terms of thinking about other kinds of organizations that could be collaborated with. And I think this also then tethers to the question you had about how do we reach people on a local level. And I just think talking more with the libraries or the other public institutions in our communities is going to be a way to foster that at a foundational level. The other thing that I just want to mention, your first question about like, okay, so we've got this great coverage. How do we make sure it's reaching people outside of the bubble or reaching people who might not otherwise see it? And I want to share a conversation I had with an Alaskan reporter who was talking about how for her, like every story is a climate story, inevitably. She's up in the Arctic region and it doesn't matter what the story is, it's going to be climate related. And for her, a really important thing was avoiding parachute journalism, that we need to think carefully about how we do cover these stories and thoughtfully. And that's where I really believe the model of a connector, where you can tag team and you can take a local reporter on the ground. Essentially, what Allison has been talking about is a really promising way of exponentially improving the people that we're reaching on a local level.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And we had a question in here about sort of misconceptions journalists bring to their attempts at covering climate change locally, and like how to kind of direct them. I mean, because it's such a complicated, nuanced topic, climate change and everything related to it. And obviously increasingly everything is related to it. So I think that is important is in partnering with outlets or organizations that we might not typically think of, can actually, like, they're lending their expertise. They know their communities. They might be averse to like the political conversation, but know what's happening in the places that they live. And so I think about that a lot. So that's interesting to hear you say that, for sure.
Yeah. I have to say our partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers is great. Again, people trust their local emergency managers. These are people who, and largely come from military or police backgrounds that go into the communities after a disaster, during a disaster. They don't care about the political conversation. They don't really kind of care why it's getting worse. They really care that it is getting worse. And how are they going to have the resources to deal with storms that are worse, and that, making sure that these alerts are getting out to people and all those kinds of things. So they're a really interesting group to work with now, because they are getting it. They're probably not spouting it the way that we try and ask them to a little bit, but they're getting it, and they're making sure, they're worried about people's lives and safety.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, they're interesting. We ran a story on Southerly about how emergency managers are preparing for for hurricane season during the pandemic, and it was funny, like how excited some of them were to like talk about what they're doing, and I mean they're trying to figure out like what the heck happens if they have to cram people into a shelter. It's just like very, very specific things that like I don't even know how they're doing it. So it's kind of fascinating, for sure. I wanted to ask, and just a reminder, put things in the Q&A if you all have questions specifically for anybody or me, and I can parse through them. So one of the, Kerry talked about this a little bit with kind of why climate change is a really good topic to collaborate on and why that's increasing. But I was wondering if you all could speak to it, since you've all probably covered other topics in your lives as reporters. What are the particular challenges and benefits of working with other newsrooms, organizations on climate related topics? Like, what do you see as really difficult about that sometimes? And what do you see as helpful because it is such a complicated issue?
In a way, there's no such thing as a local story. On one level, there's no such thing as a local climate story, because climate is a global phenomenon. And what Germany does to reduce emissions affects the United States as much as it affects Germany. So when we partner with a local news organization, we bring that kind of expertise in those sort of in the global sciences and the global verities of climate, knowledge of, IPCC reports and so forth. And the local people know who the people are who are suffering and who the local officials are to hold accountable, or what the local officials have done, or in most cases haven't done, to address any of this. So for us, it's a very kind of nice fit in, we bring very complementary skills to the table often.
Yeah, similarly. And I think what's interesting is, some newsrooms are like, oh, we have a science reporter, but like Vernon said, like, it's not just like a local story, and it's not just like a science story. These are stories about health and our financial future. And so when we can get someone from another team that's not your typical climate or science reporter, I think that really, starts to make the writing better and the storytelling better. If we get a financial reporter who's talking about, something, or, a food editor, talking about the impacts on local food chains from climate. Those are my favorites, when we get someone who crosses over, who isn't the science reporter, but the sports reporter is like, oh, we got to do a story on this. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's great. We had a question in here from Oliver about if you could reach everybody in the country with these stories, but they can only handle a certain amount per week of climate change stories. How do you sort of pick what to prioritize or what to focus on? And I guess especially for people that haven't done these kinds of collaborations before, if there's like a good entry point. My dog barks, sorry.
Okay, that's great. For us too, we deal so much, we started with meteorology, and so our meteorologists are the core of our program. So we really have to do something that's happening in the weather right now. So, heat and different things. We won't do a snow story or, blizzard story, even if a great paper comes out on, snow, we won't do that. We also, again, we partner with and try to amplify some of the climate scientists that we know. So we know that no journalist is going to do a story that they don't know about some paper that's coming out on hazardous smoke, right? And so we try and get that in front of them and say, hey, we can help you. We have some graphics if you guys want to tell this story. So we try and do stories that are happening right now. That's one of our key things.
And Lyndsey, like you at Southerly, we're trying more and more to write stories about climate that make an emotional impact with people. We find that, when you can make an emotional impact, the story really sticks with people. You've burned your story into their synapses. So for example, we're doing one of our reporters who lives in South Portland, Maine, which happens to be an oil port and stinks all the time from these oil tanks, is doing a first-person narrative story about her and her neighbors, trying to figure out what is coming out of these tanks. And is it harming our kids? And surprisingly, no one really knows. And the stories had a lot of impact. Her stories have sort of led to a monitoring program by the state. We're in year 2, and this year we're partnering. The Bangor Daily News is running all of the stories, and the Pulitzer Center is funding them. So it's a great collaboration. But those are stories that are really kind of speak to, people emotionally about their lives and their kids' lives, and how to kind of get this information about what they're breathing.
Yeah, Vernon, I love that series. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
It's really, I've been following that one. It's phenomenal.
I think one other thing is the framework of solutions journalism can be really valuable in preventing burnout.
Yes, and we struggled out with that a little bit because we want to make sure we stay away from advocacy, and so it's a balance. And sometimes I have tension with my scientists and with our legal staff about how we can tell solution stories without saying we're advocating for something. So yeah, we did a battery storage report last year. I think it balanced it well to show that this is an option, especially in places that are putting up a lot of wind and solar. And it's just something in the news that we thought we needed to get that information into the hands of local journalists. But that's always a tough one for us. And we're trying. We're really trying to figure that one out.
Yeah, I found that sort of thinking about solutions in the sense of just how is somebody or some community responding, and like it doesn't actually have to be a long-term solution, or it's obviously not a silver bullet, but found a lot of, and especially I think about this right now during the pandemic, it's like you see so many great community efforts, and that's the same with climate change work, I think, or environmental justice work. It's like there have been people that have been working on this for a long time, and like what can we sort of learn from each other. It's been interesting to like find stories within that. We had one question about how effective, like covering climate change virtually versus on the ground. And I mean, I think this is sort of where the collaborations come in really handy. Like we did one with Climate Central where the Climate Central reporter had the data work, and then there was a local Georgia-based journalist who did sort of the on-the-ground reporting. So I feel like that can come in handy with collaborations, but what do you all see in your work?
That's exactly what we want to happen. So we can have a lot of national data sets that we can run numbers and look at, you know, heat happening in different areas of the country, but then we can go to someone local and say, hey, you know, you're the one who's going to go and find, you know, what's happening. Do you have cooling centers, you know, ready for this summer? Do you, you know, who's getting most affected? You know, which communities in your, you know, community are going to be most impacted? Is it the seniors? Is it people of color? If, you know, the pools are closed down in Philadelphia this summer, how are kids going to get cooled down? So we don't know all that. So we want our local journalists to, you know, try and feed us that so we can give them the data that backs up that storytelling, and they do the storytelling. We just vet their science.
Yeah, and one other question we had that a few people have asked, and I've been thinking about a lot, is how do you all approach, when you're writing about climate issues, how are you approaching environmental justice and centering communities of color in particular that often shoulder the burden of climate change and of pollution and of all of these things? So how are you kind of centering that in your story and making sure you're getting a wide array of perspectives and getting, again, to that, like getting into the communities we're covering, right?
Yeah, so for us, again, it's looking at that data, working with our health experts, and so that they help us pitch that story to local news organizations, that this is impacting people differently and impacting communities differently. Flooding impacts different communities. You know, a lot of them are, you know, the poorer communities, or, you know, are in the low-lying areas because, you know, the wealthy people moved up high. So, and that there's, you know, decades of that going on. And I think there's been a lot of great research showing, you know, heat islands, you know, impact people of color communities more so, and lower income communities more. So there's a lot of good data. Like now the social scientists and the climate scientists, I think, are coming together more than ever. That helps us, if there's those different layers of science added on, for us to help get people to tell those stories.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of good work, I think, in the collaborations that I see, whether it's freelancers or staff journalists or organizations that are led by people of color that are in the communities they're writing about. So it's like, as we all know, you can parachute in from like whatever. It doesn't have to just be like New York to Georgia or whatever. It can be from state to state. So I think, yeah, again, getting the nuances by hiring people that live there is super important. Just one more quick question and then we'll wrap up unless anybody has anything else. I thought I wanted to hear from you all. You know, a lot of people listening to this or in general at this conference might not have done a collaboration before. And I wonder if you could just talk through like how to pick a story that might be good for that on the front end, or how to start. Vernon and I talked a little bit about how to start a conversation, right? But what are some ways that you think, especially local news outlets, that newsrooms that might be listening, could get started in this? Because I imagine it seems a little daunting at first, especially like thinking about all this data and everything. Yeah, what kind of advice do you all have?
Well, I like your approach of just start talking. You know, just start talking about it. And you know, if you're a city editor on a regional paper, and you need somebody who, like me, who spends all their time now thinking and writing about climate, you know, it won't take long before the city editor is asking me questions about climate and what we're doing, or I'm asking him questions about his community and what he's seeing and how people think about climate change. And, you know, getting journalists in a room together talking is, I think, a great way to, you know, find stories and start working on them. And a lot of it is just that mindset, like Mark was saying, you know, we used to live in this ultra competitive world. I guess a lot of people still do, depending upon where they work. But what I find so liberating now is to be away from that. So you're not just sort of hiding your findings until you feel like publishing them, but you're sharing them. And by sharing them, you're increasing their power and you're increasing their reach. And people respond to ideas. And, you know, the thing about climate is it's everywhere. Like you said, it's in every community. I mean, how many stories can you say this about? It's in every community. It affects every aspect of everyone's life, you know, amazingly. You know, it's funny, we had the staff meeting at the beginning of the pandemic and you know, gee, is anybody going to want to read about climate change now with all this attention focused on the pandemic? And what we found, you know, quite the opposite. You know, there are all these crossovers to climate from the pandemic, and we've never been busier and we've never been more flooded with ideas. And, you know, it just comes from the conversation.
Yeah, and I think the same thing. Look at our site, look at our tools. The nice thing about our site, so if you're coastal, you can do a story on, you know, sea level rise and storms from those tools. But all of our media library, you can search on by your location. So you can see where, you know, we have these draw down graphics. So you can see, you know, how many days have been over 90-degree heat index, you know, and how they've gone up over time. There's certain parts of the country that aren't heating up. The upper Midwest is actually kind of cooling. So there are different stories, and we try and also give those explanations. But, you know, then you contact us and say, why is my city not getting hot? We don't understand why Macon, Georgia isn't getting as hot as some other parts of the Southeast. So there is, like, you know, there is microclimate, and so not every story can be told absolutely everywhere. But there's a lot of regional patterns, and so we do try and, you know, reach out and make sure that people understand what's happening regionally. If it's not, we can't give you the, you know, we can't tell you that that's not happening. Precipitation's happening, actually, just pretty much everywhere, getting more rain, lots of parts of the country, except for the West, where they need it for the drought and the wildfire season. So it is different things happening regionally. So go look in our, you know, our website and, you know, put in your local area and see all that data. It's right there for you. And there's really cool graphics that we can give you.
I'd also share, I've come across an organization called Skyline. I don't know if that's one that any of you all have heard of, but if you are on deadline as a reporter and you want to clarify either like a report you're making your way through, or you want to make sure that you're like accurately explaining something, you can submit online your question and they will connect you with a scientist. And they have an amazing track record of doing it on deadline in a pretty fast, expedited way, which is very cool. The other thing that I just think is important when we're talking about this conversation is thinking about jargon, and when we're using words that can make us feel like we know what we're talking about, but can actually be sort of exclusionary. I think that can be really helpful in making sure that people get involved. You know, that they don't feel like, oh, I'm going to tune this out now because I have no idea what they're talking about when they use those words.
Yeah, and I think that's like the historical practice of journalists when it comes to climate change in a lot of places. So so definitely, and just kind of getting on people's level and how are they understanding it. And again, like I said earlier, I feel like I mean, every story, I think everyone has said this in some form or fashion, every story is kind of becoming a climate story, and how can we just include more people in that conversation, which collaboration obviously lends itself to. Well, I think that is all the questions that I had. It's a couple of minutes early, but I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you to our panelists, Allison and Kerry and Vernon, and to the Center for Cooperative Media and Stefanie and Ned and Mark. I forgot to mention Mark, who left a few minutes early, and thanks to everyone who came to listen. I really appreciate it. I'll put my contact info in here too, because I'm happy to talk more about this, and I'm sure our panelists are too. So yeah, let us know. Thank you.